It's really good for procedurally populating, a ground plane with little cards that you're going to use for grass. You can make necklaces with it. I found a super great way to make barbed wire in literally like 6 minutes. Someone in one of my classes is doing like a bat with barbed wire on it. That wasn't just me thinking of random things. And it's like fairly straightforward to use, honestly. You can do a lot of crazy stuff with animation in it. But right now I'm just going to show you kind of like the basics of how you might model a few things in MASH that will be maybe more specifically useful for your finals. So first thing I'm going to go over is just like a little necklace. It's simple and like a relatively straightforward sort of thing to start with. So I'm going to start with a bead. It's not a pretty bead. And I'm going to start with a curve for the shape of my necklace. And just for grins, I'm going to make this maybe vaguely more necklace shaped and just be like, great, it's a necklace. All right, caps lock. So to actually do something interesting with MASH, you want to basically select, in this case, the bead or like the object that you want to be duplicating. Select that, and up here where you see, like normally there's like the curves, polymodeling, these little graphic tabs up here. There's a tab for MASH. First thing you're going to want to do, and this is going to get pretty much repetitive for all the demos, you want to create a MASH network. The button on the very left, click it. And you can see that it's actually gone in and basically added in like 10 little copies of my bead. And these copies are actually instances of the original bead, which is, if you look here, it is still floating around in my scene. So here is my original bead, and here are all the copies. So it's made this little like MASH one node, and also created this little MASH repro mesh. I do actually appreciate MASH for the fact that you can generate hundreds of objects, and it treats them all like a single thing, so you don't need to have like 700 things just different in your outliner. So I have these very awkward beads in a line, which is kind of random. I would like to go in and, make something more interesting happen with these, obviously. First thing, there's a little tab up here, directly to the right of the Create MASH network. It's called MASH Editor. If you click on that, it's going to pull up this little window. It's pretty much just like a little mini outliner specifically for MASH stuff. The more nodes you add, the more like complex this gets, and it totally is easier when you get like 5 nodes into this than trying to find everything in the attribute editor. So anywho, the first thing I want to look at to change the way that these are displaying is this little MASH distribute node right here. So I'm just going to click on that, pulls up the attributes, and first thing I can change is the number of little bead copies it makes. You can also change the distribution type, so I can make this radial, spherical, etc. Oh, that's magical. I just noticed that they used to combine, it looks like they combined some of the scripting stuff that used to be like more hardcore scripting in Maya, hardcore simple scripting, I guess, into MASH. But anyway, so you can play with like the, distribute X, Y, Z, etc. You can also play with rotation, scale. I feel like most of these are like fairly self-explanatory. So I'm just going to leave this kind of as it is for now. Next thing I want to do, so like obviously I don't just want, it's supposed to be a necklace, not just like an awkward line of beads. So I need to find a way to get these to follow my curve. To do that, I'm going to go back and just click on this little MASH 1 node. It's going to take me back here and show me just a crap ton of a lot of different little nodes that I have to work with. In this case, I would like my beads to follow the curve, so I'm going to use the curve node. Click it, and just do add curve node. And if you don't have a curve selector when you do this, it's just going to give you this little empty box. So I'm just going to click on my NURB circle 1, my necklace curve, and middle mouse button drag that into here. You can see, again, it pops up, and my beads have snapped to not to the curve, but to at least somewhere that's not a totally straight line. If you guys ever see this happening, this is probably because in the MASH distribute node, leaving X set at a specific distance is probably like translating these little beads away from the curve. So as soon as I set that to 0, the beads are actually following the curve. Huzzah. In this case, it's also kind of weird that they're all bunched together in one specific area. So if you look under your curve node again, this little step attribute here, If you select this to 0, all the things are going to be bunched into a single point. Set it to 1, they're going to distribute evenly along the curve. Also, probably it makes more sense to add a few more beads to this. So, I mean, doing this, you pretty much have, like, instant 10-second pearl necklace, question mark, if you need that. Other cool thing about MASH is, the same way if you're working with, like, extruded NURB surfaces, I can modify this curve, and it's going to modify the positioning of my beads. So there's a few different things you can do to actually animate these curves if you want to, so you could have, like, a necklace flopping around, dropping on the floor. I'm not super going to go over that. If anyone's interested, it's dynamic curves. Yeah, it just doesn't seem super relevant to this class since you're not doing anything moving. Alright, so we have like a super basic necklace. It's not pretty by any stretch of the imagination. And if I throw in a light in here and get out a crappy render, so like the NURBS curve isn't going to render because it's a NURBS curve. So what you can do is basically just make yourself another little, NURBS circle and just do a regular NURBS like surface extrude. So select your little circle, select the necklace, go to surfaces, extrude, and check your settings. So I find for the extrude tool for NURBS, usually I just end up selecting everything on the right side of this little panel. It just seems to work out well every time. And I should actually select my objects. Cool. Alright, so now we have like a weird little string going through my beads. And this one should actually show up in a render because it is not just a curve. I feel like it also makes sense to put holes in your beads. And this is where it comes in really handy that this is actually this original bead and all of these guys are kind of instanced together. So this is one thing. So does anyone need a refresher the difference between a instance and just a copy or duplicated object? All right. Basically, instances will, if you modify one, it'll modify all of them. If you do, so for some reason, MASH, if you rotate the original object, you can see all the beads in the background rotating as well. I'm not entirely sure why MASH takes rotation of the original object. If you do like a duplicated special, it doesn't, and you move one of the instances, it'll just let you rotate it freely. But this one, if you do rotate the original, it's going to rotate your MASH one. So I'm just going to take my bead, turn it 90 degrees. You can see that now the geometry in the ends pretty much lines up with the holes, or with the little cord that I've made. And I'm just going to spastically chop out holes in the side, in the side of this bead, and basically just bridge them back together, and then you have instant holes. I'm rendering in the background, aren't I? I am. All right. My computer is being laggy, and I'm like, why? And I'm like, I'm rendering in the background. All right. Cool. So now I have awkward little beads, and you can see, again, that all of the beads have interactively updated, and now you pretty much have like a nice necklace with like strung beads on it. And then again, if I go in and I edit this control vertex, as long as I haven't like deleted history on any of these objects, all of these new beads that I've made are going to continue to stay aligned with that original curve no matter how I move it. All right, any questions so far? Cool. All right, so I'm just gonna throw a really quick texture on these. No, there's a few other things that you can do to your beads to help give things a little bit of variation. One of them is adding a random node, which I would actually highly recommend doing because it just makes everything look kind of nicer. Show me my textures. Hang on. There we go. That's actually not what I wanted. Yellow. Some really questionable looking beads. All right. If this isn't the ugliest bead setup you've ever seen, great. All right. So I mentioned random nodes. So right now, if you particularly texture these beads with like a repeating pattern, it's fairly obvious that all of the beads are facing exactly the same direction, and it looks a little bit unnatural. So again, random nodes are your friend. I'm going to click into my MASH network again. There's a node, literally just called random. Click said random node, add it, and you can see that by default it's sort of spastically scattered my beads in space, which doesn't make sense for what I'm trying to do here. So I'm just going to, it basically gives you, it's like, think of this as a random number generator with nice UI. Excuse me. Basically for what it does is for every instance of this little bead, it's going to look at all these slider values and randomly pick a number between 0 and whatever you set the max of this to be. And that's how it sort of creates that random positioning of all the different beads. So in this case, I don't really want the position to change. Like I want these to actually hang out on the necklace where I put them. But what I can play with is rotation. So usually I'll just end up playing like clearly Y is wrong because it's pulling the beads off the hole. Same thing with Z. If you play with the X rotation, you can see that it's sort of gone through and randomly rotated all my beads. So I have a little bit more of a naturalistic variation in the color distribution of the texture I put on. And you can also play with scale if you want. So usually I'll put scale on stuff, not necessarily anything like super crazy high numbers, but just like a little tiny bit. Like even pearls, like just a pearl necklace, all the pearls are slightly different sized because like they're not made by machines, they're made in like the mantle of clams and such. So I usually will use random nodes a lot. You can also change the seed value. Basically this is just gonna change sort of how the randomization calculates. I'm not entirely sure the best way to explain that, but if any of you are familiar with Binding of Isaac, and someone posts like, oh, I played the best map ever, here's the seed, using the same seed is going to generate like the same maps. So the seed is basically just like a random, super large, like random number that the computer uses to calculate the randomization, if that makes any sense. If it doesn't make sense, just know that you can take the random seed and change it to vary how the random node affects your object. Any questions on that? All right. So strength is, I'll go over this like a little bit later for a grass demo. Basically, it's kind of an opacity slider for your randomness. So again, if I set this to 0, it basically turns the node off. Set it to like 50%, it doesn't quite affect it as much, etc. That's pretty much the random node. And that's pretty much making a necklace with MASH. Any questions on this before I just like show you a quick barbed wire demo? Cool. All right, so I am just going to delete all of this. All right. All right, so I'm just gonna, for my barbed wire, again, I'm gonna start with a curve. I want something that the little extruded surface I make can actually follow. I'm just gonna do something weird, like a simple basic knot. Great. I'm actually gonna take 5 seconds to make this look like it's actually looping into itself in a somewhat interesting fashion. All right, whatever, close enough. All right, so we have our base curve. I think, did I show you guys, I think a while ago I might have done that little demo about doing braided rope in Maya. But this is gonna be a really similar thing. So instead of extruding a curve along this curve I've just made, I'm going to extrude a polygon surface. So in this case, if you've ever, looked at barbed wire, sometimes I'll be like animating stuff or like researching things for writing, and I'm like, what does my internet history look like? I'm just researching like axes, murder weapons, and barbed wire. But basically all barbed wire is usually 1 or 2 pieces of wire that's twisted together, and then tiny pieces of cut wire that's wrapped around that braided wire to make the spiky, painful death spikes. So again, you can recreate that fairly easily in Maya, it turns out, with MASH. So I have basically these 2 little planes here, and I'm going to mesh combine these. These are going to be become my little piece of wire. I'm also going to delete history on them, and oh, that is super hard to see. All right, and I'm just going to grab these guys and drag them as close to the front of the curve as I can get them. Say that's good. To extrude these guys along the curve, you need to, don't ask me why, if you're extruding a polygon object along a curve, you need to select the faces of that polygon object. If you select the whole object, for some reason it won't work. So select face of this object, shift select your curve, and then just go up to your basic extrude tool that you would usually use if you're doing poly modeling. You can see that it does whatever the heck this is, which isn't particularly appealing in any stretch of the imagination. So I'm just going to add some more divisions into this little pop-up. And I'm actually going to say, what if I add like 500 divisions, because I'm feeling like kind of a crazy person. And you can see that now we have like this weird little roller coaster looking track kind of thing. Actually, you could totally use this principle to make a roller coaster and then probably also use Mash to populate slats on it. Now that I think about that, that would be a great thing to play with. But anywho, so you have this. It doesn't look particularly braided or wrapped, so for that I need to edit the twist of this extrude. If you happen to still have this little window here pulled up, a little hamburger menu in the side, if you click that, it gives you a whole drop down of attributes that are affected by this extrude but not necessarily shown in that drop box. So I'm just going to scroll down, find twist, click it, and you can see that now I have access to the twist. And you're probably going to have to set this to something really, really high, like 3000. But you can see that as soon as I do that, this little wire is like starting to twist together and look kind of more like braided barbed wire. One thing you will notice, and this is just going for like curve stuff in general, if you're extruding along a curve, I find it not a terrible idea to go back and normalize your curve. So right now, if I, where is it? So I look at this curve, I look at the layout of control vertices. There's, right around this curve, there's like a whole lot of them. And you'll notice that if I look at this little extruded surface, the twist tends to be more aggressive where there's more control vertices on the original curve, and much less twisted where there are fewer control vertices. So normally what I'll do is just grab that curve. You can go up to the curves menu and scroll all the way to the almost bottom and do rebuild. And basically what I'm going to do is just sort of, again, choose a number of control vertices I want. I'm just going to say 20. And lay them out uniformly along the selected curve. So what this is going to do, I'm going to hit apply. You can see it's actually changed the twist of that extrude there. But basically now what I have is 20 control vertices evenly laid out along this curve. And again, that's just going to help with like stuff like extrudes. If you're turning this into a polygon object later, it makes the geometry a little bit more regular. So it's not, a lot of times I'll end up doing that at some point during the, modeling process. But yeah, so I want to modify this curve. I maybe want this a little bit more twisted. My Dropbox is gone. If you have not deleted history on this object, you should be able to go into your channel box, and you'll see under inputs that they have this little poly extrude face sitting right here. If you click that, you should be able to go in and modify all of the values again. And this goes for if you've ever done like a bevel or anything else. You should be able to go back in and modify that in your channel box. So in this case, I'm going to say, what if I want the twist to be 5,000? 7,000? Cool. So like now we have a super cool little twisty, ropey kind of thing. At this point, I'm going to make a little bit of barbed wire for this that is going to, once I use Mash to populate it along the curve, end up looking like spiky barbed wire. So I found the easiest way to make like this little piece of wrapped wire. If you look at it, it's pretty much just a helix with really long ends. So I'm going to start with a helix and make some really long ends on it. Helix, and just be like, oh, great. I'm just going to do something not super pretty. All right, so we have this helix. One thing I have noticed is it helps to make sure, so right now if I look at these faces, if I grab these and just sort of extrude these straight out, they end up going out in a straight line from each other, which looks more like, not so much like barbed wire and more like some kind of weird clothespin spring. So I have found that it is not a bad idea to go into your helix and set coils to be like some slightly offset value, so that if I grab these end caps again, gonna extrude these, pull them out, ooh, that was too much. But you can see it kind of maybe gives like a little more spiky, aggressive, like directional look to this. Anywho, so this is basically just going to be my like sketchy little barbed wire coil bit. So I'm going to grab this thing and go up to my mesh menu again, click on the create mesh network, and now I have 10 duplicates of these wonderful little wire spikes. So I'm going to do pretty much the same thing I did last time. I'm just going to go into my distribute node. I know that I want distance to be 0 because I'm going to attach this to a curve. So I'm just going to set that to 0. Go into my mesh node, add a curve node, grab my barbed wire curve, middle mouse button, drag that in, and now these are hanging out on the curve. So I'm just going to set step to 1 to actually distribute these guys over the length of the barbed wire. And you'll notice that, I mean, by default, these look pretty ridiculous, like they're not even close to like, clipping through everything. They look horrible. This is one of those instances where, like, I don't know why MASH pays attention to the translation or rotation of the original object, but if you just rotate this kind of like 90 degrees, that now you have all of these little strings, or like these little barbed bits, sitting on the actual wire. So this is like pretty much barbed wire in a nutshell. I, again, like to go through with a random node, because right now, if you look at it, all of these little spikes are facing the same direction, and it takes like 10 seconds to go through and just add another random node, again, set position to 0 for everything, and then fiddle with the, I guess in this case, X rotation, and now all of the little spikes are kind of facing different directions, and the overall feel of this feels a little bit more natural. But that is pretty much how to make digital barbed wire in case you forever need to do that for some reason. Any questions on that or any of the MASH stuff that we've gone over so far? All right. Other MASH thing that I want to show you guys real quick is how you can use MASH to populate objects along the surface of a mesh. So this would be good for if you're adding like cards to a landscape that you've made, or, you know, I suppose you could add it for like, you could use it, I guess, to populate like tack pins on a pegboard or something like that. If you were so inclined, you could actually use it to, now that it occurs to me, to make, if you had an object where you wanted like a bunch of plane hair on it, you could use them to make thick hair on something with planes. So, all right, so first thing I'm going to start with is just, I'll show you guys how to do like a really sketchy like card snow. All right, so I have a plane, I have a ground plane, and this is my like super awkward little card snow plane. I'm just gonna, as a personal preference, I'm just gonna set the pivot point to the bottom of this object and snap it directly on my ground plane. It doesn't super matter, and then I'm just gonna freeze the transformations on this. I find if you don't freeze transformations, sometimes MASH will make stuff clip through the ground plane kind of weird. So I'm actually gonna leave these for now, and then I'll show you what happens if that happens. But, so again, this is gonna be like really sketchy how to make a very aggressive snowfield with cards and MASH. So grab your sketchy card, go to your MASH menu, create a MASH network, and again, now you have this like weird copies, like 10 copies of your object, and they're clipping through the ground plane. So that was the thing where I mentioned like your original object is up here, and these are like hanging out down here. As soon as I freeze transformations on this original card, your MASH objects are going to snap up to the ground plane and decide to be in a different place. So that's usually why I'll freeze transformations, mostly just so that things actually hang out on the ground plane where I want them. So I'm actually going to go in and just, there's no practical reason to do that, I just kind of want to show you some of the different settings in MASH. So I'm going to go into my distribute for the MASH node, and I'm going to say, all right, distance X is dumb, and I don't care about that as a thing. What I want for this one is distribution type. So there's like linear, radial. You'll see there's also an option for mesh. If I click on that, it's going to be like, give me a mesh, and then I'll put these cards on it. So if I grab my ground plane, and again, middle mouse button, drag that, just dump it onto input mesh. That's super, oh. All right. So I was like, why is this not populating? Like, why are these floating off of the outside of my mesh? I think what is happening here, usually I go in and I put my little card thing directly on the origin. And I would guess that as soon as I do that and freeze transformations on that, if I hide that, go back, look at my mesh thing, you can see that all the cards are now actually set up on my mesh, instead of completely floating off in the side things. So not a bad idea to keep your little mesh objects either on the origin or really close to the origin. Sometimes it does kind of cause weird stuff like it just did. But yeah, so we have these like very weird little cards. Whatever. Obviously this isn't a particularly, nice looking snow effect from this angle. So what I'm going to do first thing is just go in and add a random node. In case you guys aren't noticing similarities between the nodes I'm using, I use a lot of random nodes. So there's really, as far as I'm concerned, no reason to modify position. These are already randomly scattered on the surface of the object. Why randomize it more? What I'm going to play with is just the rotation Y. And you can see that as I do that, the cards, for the most part, except for like right here, you don't ever really like see completely through that field of cards. In this case, I'm going to say maybe I actually want like more like 15 cards. So you can populate however many you want in your distribute node. Once you actually set this type to mesh, there are a few different methods that you can use to place the objects on the mesh. So the first one, by default, it sets it to scatter, which is pretty much just put your different little objects on random points on the surface of this target mesh. You can also set this to vertex. It's going to go through and just put a card on every single vertex on the side of this. You can do random vertex, you could do face center. There's like a whole lot of random options. Usually I just use scatter. You can also turn, if you're in your little mesh editor, you can turn on and off different nodes with these little toggle bars. Basically now I'm just going to go through and kind of turn this into something that looks more like a traditional card. So I'm going to assign it a new material, Arnold, standard surface shader, and go to my geometry tab and map in something for opacity. So in this case, I'm trying to recreate snow, and I found this like really sketchy dot texture, which looks kind of like a hole punch went nuts. If you were doing snow, I would encourage you to make a nicer texture with maybe a slight variation in the actual snow tufts. But for now, I'm just going to use this. Also, set my object to be not opaque. And, alright, so if I render this now, with a physical sky in here, you should see, basically I've made Swiss cheese because I've set my maps up the wrong way. But there are a few settings. So again, easiest way to fix that would just be to go in and just do an invert on my opacity. What am I doing? Effects, invert. Now I have like actual kind of fake snow. So it looks a little weird. Like obviously this is gonna look kind of weird from top down, but if you look at it from the side, say the areas right here where it's like just not quite enough cards. If you scroll through this, for the most part, it usually does a fairly reasonable job of generating something that looks kind of like a snowfield, sort of. So if any of you guys need to put, snow outside a window or something for your scene, this could be a way to do it. You don't need a whole lot, just put like a few little cards just sort of hanging out right outside your window. Enough that you'll see them in the render, but not enough that they're just sort of floating around forever in your scene. Like you literally can just do a tiny column of these outside your window and it'll look enough like snow. If you are using Arnold and/or Redshift, there is one thing, there's like a few settings that I think are kind of weird that I usually turn off. So for one, I don't necessarily want the snow to self-shadow itself. So basically, like if light hits that snow, it's going to cast a shadow on another part of the snow. I find like occasionally it ends up with some weird effects where it'll make the areas where the cards meet and intersect really, really obvious. So I'm just going to go into my shape node for this little mesh, and pretty much in the Arnold tab where you usually find the checkbox for opacity, just scroll down. There's an option for self shadows. As soon as I turn that off, you can see that there is significantly less shadowing on the snow, especially in this area. There's still some shadowing because of the positioning of the cards, but it does just kind of get rid of, you can see, a lot of the existing shadows on there. So usually I'll turn that off. If you want to turn off cast shadows so that your snow doesn't cast shadows on the ground, you can do that. You turn off a lot of weird settings here if you want to. Excuse me. But I'm just going to go back into my surface shader and invert this again. So again, now we have like a weird sort of little snowfield. And again, you can use this for like rain or a bunch of other stuff. You could also use this to just populate, instead of using giant cards for snow, you could make a wiggly little ground plane and use it to populate plants arbitrarily across your scene. And you could do a few different ones. So you had one for grass, where there's like a lot of grass, one for flowers that show up less frequently, that kind of thing. Yeah. Any questions about that? Cool. One thing you can do that's kind of weird. Oh, so for one, actually, if you guys are ever looking to get this into Unity or similar, this is pretty much Maya just treats this like an object, so you can duplicate this, move it over here. This is like totally exportable. Haven't directly tried exporting this, but pretty much the same thing. If you're using a deformer, if you like duplicate the object, you can change the original, and the duplicate isn't going to change. It's not an instance to copy. So again, this is something, a piece of geometry you can export very easily into Unity or similar for use in terrain, etc. That's pretty much my shtick on Mash and weird little cards. Does anyone have any questions about that? Cool. So really quick, I'm going to run through with just like one more demo, a little bit about adding you know, grass to a field. There's some like kind of interesting stuff with animation I want you to show you that might possibly help with, you know, setting up slightly more complex pieces of geometry. So I'm just going to run through that super quick. All right, start with my sketchy ground plane. Start with what is going to be the sketchiest piece of grass ever created. Amazing. So same thing I did with my cards. I'm just going to rotate this thing 90 degrees and set my pivot to the very bottom of the object and dump that on the origin. I will then freeze my transformations, so this should be sitting pretty much directly on the ground plane. Yes, good. All right, so I'm going to make this terrain slightly more interesting. Again, just using the soft select because I'm being lazy. Turn off my grid because it's kind of annoying. All right, so I have my ground. Got my sketchy grass. I'm going to go in and do a little bit of shaping to this grass with just a flare deformer. So deform nonlinear flare, mostly just because I want the top of the grass to be a little bit narrower. Flare deformers happen to be a convenient way to do that. So I'm just like, cool, I kind of don't hate that. I'm going to just delete the history on that object. Grass. Don't give me that. All right, and I'm also just going to really quick throw just like a silly little ramp shader on this, just so it's a little bit easier to distinguish the grass from the ground. Because once I put like 500 pieces of grass on, it does get a little hard to see what's happening. All right. All right. This is the prettiest grass that has ever existed. All right. So I'm going to do pretty much the exact same thing I just did. Grab my grass, go to Mash, make a Mash network, and I am going to go to my Mash distribute node and set the distribution type to mesh. Then I'm going to grab my p-plane 1 ground mesh and throw that into input mesh. And again, because I'm a dingus, I have not centered my objects on the origin, and everything is kind of floating off in space, which is obviously less than desirable. And I've also hidden my grid. Fantastic. All right, I'm just going to shift this over. Be like, great. Perfect. All right, so moved object back on origin, first transformation again, and now I'm going to unhide this. You can see that even though I shifted my mesh over, the objects still follow it, so I'd be like, hey. All right, so I'm going to go back into my distribute node. I'm going to open my little Mash editor here. And I'm going to add a bunch more points to this. So we have, you know, now the ugliest stretch of grass that has ever existed. You can't look at this and tell me this is pretty looking. But, so there's one setting that I find usually I end up checking off because it sort of causes issues later. So you'll notice right now if I look at this piece of grass from the z-axis, original grass is facing the camera pretty directly. All of the other grasses are facing the x-axis. Again, not entirely sure why it defaults to doing that, but sometimes it does. You'll also notice that the little grasses sort of follow the curvature of the ground here. There's an option in the distribute node that is calculate rotation here. As soon as I turn that off, you'll notice that all of the grasses start facing the camera the same as the original one has, and they're pointing directly up towards the sky or y-axis rather than just sort of following the curvature of the ground. Depending on what you're doing, it makes more or less sense to do that. In this case, for grass, it grows straight up even if it's on a hill, so this makes more sense. So one thing that is kind of interesting that you can do is you can mash animated objects. So if you thing I think of most is if you're doing like, you have a bunch of dragons and they're flying and you have a flock of flying dragons. If you do an animated version of the wings, it would look super weird if they all flap their wings at exactly the same time. So you can use mash to create the flock of dragons, but also stagger the animation of the wings so that they are flapping in a more natural fashion. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go in and throw a, I didn't twist-deformer, what the heck. I'm going to throw a twist-deformer on this grass. I've been doing bend in the other classes, and I feel like I need to shake it up a little bit. Where am I going? Twist handle. Meh. All right, let's go to my twist. I am just going to key the start angle, or which one do I actually want? End angle? All right. I'm going to key the end angle at 0. And I'm just going to say go for maybe like 45 frames of animation here. It doesn't need to be super precise. I'm just kind of doing stuff. So I'm just right-clicking on the attribute that I want to key and doing set key rather than keying all of the available attributes. So then I'm going to twist the ever-living crap out of this thing, apparently. Do key selected. So now if I scrub through my time slider, you can see that this piece of grass is just sort of twisting and untwisting in a fairly arbitrary fashion. If I go out and look at my mesh network, all of my grasses are twisting in a super weird and arbitrary fashion. So whatever, like literally whatever you do to this, deforming it, animating with a rig, manually changing the geometry, it's going to apply to all of these mesh objects. So I play this, looks really weird. Again, I'm just going to set my playback speed to from every frame free to max real time. And you can see that now these are a little bit less aggressive in their twisting speed. I will say, and I'll kind of mention this again, but in case I haven't said this before, viewing things like this, just like hitting play and watching stuff in the viewport, does not always give you an accurate representation of the speed things are happening in. Especially like for simulations, that slows down the render really, really fast. So it ends up looking way slower than it actually is. If you do, I'm going to show you a thing in Match in a few seconds where it'll also slow down the animation pretty dramatically if you have like 500 pieces of grass on here. So if you care about the actual speed, you should really like play blast this out. Just right click in your time slider and do play blast. This will, based on the little settings you choose here, it'll save you a little video that is like a real-time video of the official final speed of whatever you're doing down here without needing to worry about like viewport lag. Anywho, so if you wanted to fiddle a little bit with the animation in this, so as an example, if you guys were like populating a field with blowing trees or something like that and you didn't want them all blowing the same way, go into your Mesh network and you can add what's called a time node. This allows you to have a little bit of control over the timing of the animations. So in this case, I'll just play my time slider. You notice what used to be a halfway decent looping animation is now stopping pretty much at frame 25. So by default, this starts out taking a chunk of animation from frame 0 to frame 25 and repeating it. So basically for the animation start and end, you just want to plug in whatever frame range you're actually interested in copying or using for your animation. In this case, 1 through 45. Huzzah. At this point, it should look like nothing really changed. What becomes interesting with this is these stagger frames. So this is basically going to go through for each little blade of grass, and again, it's pretty much just a random number generator, but it's going to, you can see sort of as I change this, it's sort of rotating some grasses and leaving some of the other ones where it is. But this is basically a random number generator, which is going to offset the animations for each grass by 0 to, 10 frames. So if I play this now, you can see that all the grasses are sort of like rotating at different times. It adds a little bit more variation to the, it's a really weird animation. It adds a little bit more variation to the spinning effect that is happening on these grasses. You do something really crazy. I'm curious to see what happens if I set this to like 20. But yeah, so you can do some like really weird effects. And again, this is like the thing I mentioned where if you have a flock of birds, you can vary their, like when they're flapping their wings by using this time node. This is also the thing where if you have a huge number of stagger frames and you have like 500 blades of grass here, it will slow your computer down like beyond belief. I'm gonna add 700 blades of grass, and look how marvelously slow that's going. So this is one of those instances where either you would play blast it so that you can actually see the real speed of this, or when you're just working on, laying out your scene, you would go through and just set this to a lower density of grass so that you don't need to worry as much about that lag. But yeah, any questions on any of this? All right. All right, so just really quick, I'm just going to go back to my time node. There is dash time. So there's time, pretty much time scale is the same thing as think of a speed. So set it to 1, it's the actual speed of the animation. If you set it lower, it slows down the animation pretty dang aggressively. Obviously setting it faster will also make these, bounce back and forth really fast, which is actually kind of cute. I don't know, something about this is endearing to me. So that's time scale. It's going to affect all of them in the same way. Random time scale is going to make some faster, some slower. It's on a per grass basis. That's pretty much all I have for the time node. But yeah, you can do really interesting things for this. And again, just by using this relatively quick node, you get a slight variation in the overall look and feel of this grass. So you can use it to just, again, create a little bit more variation in your scene should you so desire. Last thing I want to show you on the grass is how to make it sort of bend in different directions. Or like if you've ever, I'm actually going to add a few more, distribute. All right. So if you ever watched wind blow across a grassy field or something like that, it creates that like sort of interesting ripple effect in the grass. You can kind of fudge that a little bit with an orient node. So just go back into my little a Mash 1 node, and then go find the orient node. Click that, add orient node. By default, it stretches everything pretty crazily, weirdly, aggressively towards the main object. Like you can see it's kind of pointing towards this first object that I made here. So you can set that to be affected by a bunch of different things. In this case, I'm just going to fiddle a little bit and see if I can make these maybe lay less completely flat at the ground. Whatever. All right, but basically, I'm honestly not entirely sure what orient mode velocity is. That seems like more of a simmy thing. Aim at target is the original mesh, and orient to mesh, it allows you to add in a new mesh to this. So I'm just going to throw in a random sphere. Be like, yay, it is my sphere. And then if you go to under your orient node again, there is a little drop down for orient to mesh options. Click on that. It'll ask for a little input mesh. Grab sphere, throw into input mesh. Sometimes it doesn't let me do it the first time, and I just have to like click off of everything, click on my orient node again, and then drag the sphere back in, and then it usually works. And you can see, at this point, it's not so much, it's pointing everything away from the sphere. If that ever happens, just there's a little, in your orient node, there's a flip axis button, click it, it'll point the stuff towards the sphere. So if I move this around, you can see everything's kind of like following this in a really crazy and ridiculous fashion. Which would be honestly pretty interesting if you're ever trying to make that effect of like the little magnetic iron shavings or whatever people use and like hourglasses and stuff like that. But you can do this if you need to. Also might be interesting if people are like, if this is like a beach ball at a concert and the these little guys are hands, and be like, hands, I'm gonna try to catch the beach ball or something. I don't know. So that's pretty much the orient node. So I just got rid of that little mesh, and it's kind of flattened everything back out again. I'm just gonna not take like a crazy amount of time. I'm just gonna see if I can get these to be a little bit clipping less aggressively through my ground plane. Maybe something like this. All right. So I'm just gonna say kind of randomly that this is my flattened grass that I'm happy with for as the wind blows over this. So still in the orient node, there are two different ways that I'm aware of to create the sort of rippling effect. One is by making a fall-off object. So if you scroll down, tab for fall-off objects, just right-click in this giant box and do create. It's going to make this giant shape for you. And you'll notice that as I push this through my grass, it is sort of systematically flattening pieces of grass. So pretty much, pretty much anywhere that is within this giant fall-off object that it's created is going to show what the mesh looks like at the orient node. Anywhere else is just going to be left as is. So you can do, and this fall-off object has its own settings. You can change the shape of it if you want, like if you wanted to make this a sphere, particles, NURBS, curves. You can even set this to be a mesh if you wanted to. I'm just going to leave it a sphere. And then this inner zone here, think of this again as sort of fall-off radius for brushes in Photoshop. So if I set that to 1, basically, not having any softness, it's pretty aggressive where like as soon as it hits a grass, it just like tips it over immediately. In this case, having something a little bit softer creates a little bit of a more natural effect where it's sort of rippling through the grass rather than just immediately crushing it. But what I can do is just go through and key this certain positions to go through and sort of create a very awkward little wind effect, basically. But I'm just going to go into my attribute editor and key the translation, go to frame 45, and key it just on the other side of my mesh. And again, just right-click on the translates and key those. So if I play this now, you can kind of see that I have this like very awkward blowing grass, and then there's an incredibly slow gust of wind blowing through and sort of flattening it in certain areas. If this is a thing that you need. I'm actually just going to delete the deformer on this because I find it kind of distracting. And interestingly, I haven't put a random node on this. I'm just going to leave it for now. What the heck? I was going to say it would be nice to sort of randomize the position of the grass, especially from this angle, but, we've done that before. But yeah, so you can see it kind of, again, just like rolls over the grass, makes an interesting effect. You can do something similar if you are so inclined with a ramp shader. So me and my mania for ramp shaders. Go back into your orient node, and I mentioned, so there's this little strength tab here. This is basically like how much of the orient effect do you want? But you can add this strength map here. So if I make this a checker texture as per my default, you can see that, well, that's actually a very awkward example, but basically in checkered areas it's flattening some grass, and in other ones they're just straight. Kind of a weird demo thing there, but I'm going to go through and throw on a ramp texture. And you can see that by default, so the black end of the texture is stand perfectly up, don't get affected by the orient node at all. And then the white side is be super affected by the orient node. So in this case, what I actually want is not a V ramp, but I find a diagonal ramp kind of looks pretty cool for this. Just toggle this around. All right, apparently it's blowing in the wrongish direction. All right. So I'm just going to swap these. So you'll notice that if I move this little black shader across my object, that it's sort of creating the rough effect that the grass is like rippling and or blowing. So what you can actually do is I'm just going to make, all right, I'm just put white on both ends. And again, my mania for ramp shaders, in case I never mentioned it, you can key the position of these specific sliders. So functionally, texturally, I've never like found a reason to do that, but you can, and for stuff like this, it's pretty useful. So in this case, I'm just going to start at, say, maybe frame 4. I'm going to click on this little black slider here because I want this to sort of ripple across my grass. I'm going to go down to selected position, right-click on it, and do set key. This is one of the ones that doesn't show the keyframe in the in the time slider, but it will say, like, if this is red, there's a keyframe on this somewhere. So I'm going to go back to frame 41, grab this little black slider, and slide it all the way over to the other side. At which point, I will, again, right-click on select position and do set key. If I play through this now, you can see that the grass is sort of doing a little bit of a wave and sort of blowing in a wavy fashion. You could also do this if you had, you know, like a specific animated texture file for a pattern of grass that you wanted blowing. Just a quick little demo of like how you could do something like this with a ramp shader. But again, this would be an interesting thing to do if you were, say, adding a, you know, you had a little field and you wanted to create the effect that the field was sort of blowing and make it a little bit more dynamic looking, even just for your still renders. This would be a really fairly easy way to do that. That's pretty much my bit for grass and Mash in general. So does anybody have any questions on this or other Mash things before we go on to the other thing that I have for you? All right, perfect.